Appreciate that very much. You know, people send me lots of humor, and I love it and appreciate it very much. Mr. Bryce actually sent me this comic for comic relief. He thinks that this is better than Rolaids. A middle-aged woman had a heart attack and was taken to the hospital. While on the operating table, she had a near-death experience, and seeing God, she asked God, "Is my time up?" And God said, "No. You have another 43 years, 2 months, and 8 days to live." Upon recovery, the woman decided to stay in the hospital and have a facelift, liposuction, and a tummy tuck. She even had someone come in and change her hair color. Since she had so much more time to live, she figured she might as well make the most of it. After her last operation and released from the hospital, she started to cross the street on her way home and was killed by an ambulance. Arriving in front of God, she demanded, "I thought you said I had another 40 years. Why didn't you pull me out of the path of the ambulance?" And God replied, "I didn't recognize you." I love it. I really appreciate it. You know, they say in speech class, Mr. Ames used to teach, know your audience. Well, when I look at our audience, I recognize that we are, lots of us, in the antique stage. And this antique couple that I heard about, a husband and wife, were having some difficulties and decided to go to a marriage counselor to get some help because they were really having marital difficulties. And so this doctor told them that oftentimes people their age had found it useful to write things down, write little notes and reminders to themselves so that they wouldn't forget. Well, this seemed like an excellent idea. So when they got home, the wife said, "Well, honey, would you please go to the kitchen and get me a dish of ice cream? Why don't you write that down so you won't forget it?" And the husband said, "Nonsense. I can remember a dish of ice cream." "Well," she said, "I'd also like some strawberries on it. You better write that down because I know you'll forget." "Don't be silly," the husband replied. "A dish of ice cream and some strawberries, I can remember that." "Okay, dear, but I'd like you to put some whipped cream on it. Now, you'd really better write this all down because you'll forget." And the husband said, "No problem. Ice cream, strawberries, whipped cream, not a problem." And so he went into the kitchen. Clang, slam, bang. Doors were opening and closing, and pots were rattling. And finally, in about 10 minutes, he came out with a tray and set it down in front of his wife. And she looked at it. He had presented her with a plate of bacon and eggs and a glass of orange juice. And the wife looked at it for a moment, and she glanced up at him with a malevolent look in her eye, and she said, "Where's the toast?" She, too, had forgotten something, I think. I think I'd better quit, because this audience is maybe a little bit too far along to understand what I'm saying, or at least to remember. Now, Mr. Nestor got that real quick when I told it to him earlier. That's why I dared to risk that on you folks, because I know that Mr. Nestor is certainly well, never mind. Let's go on and let's not go there. He's very sharp. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of faith. I think faith is the most profound doctrine in the Bible. And the reason I think it's difficult for us to understand it is because it is, in truth, a matter of the Spirit. It is truly spiritual. Faith is a subject, I think, that defies comprehension by the natural mind of man. The natural mind sees natural things and the physical things, as Paul said in Romans chapter 8 and verse 5. Paul said, "They that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." And in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, 1 Corinthians 2:14, he also said, But the natural man receives not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. So there are some things Paul understood and explained that are spiritually understood, only spiritually understood, and I think that faith is one of those fundamental doctrines that can only be understood by the Spirit of God. Now, the world as we view it, you and I, as human beings, is incomprehensible to other of God's creation. Let's take, for example, the aphid. Have you ever worked with your plants and found these little gnat-like bugs that crawl on your hands, and you look on the plants, particularly in your rose bushes, and you find aphids crawling all over them? Can you imagine in your mind what the aphid sees when he looks out over the world? It isn't what you see. And if you had the ability to communicate to an aphid in aphid talk, you could not communicate to that aphid what Los Angeles, California, or Chicago, Illinois, or New York City, or Paris, or London, or any of the major cities, or what the ocean is all about. An aphid simply couldn't comprehend it, because we're worlds apart. In the same way, I think we simply cannot naturally comprehend the faith of God, the faith that Jesus Christ had, because of his knowledge, which went back for eternity. It's just an impossibility for us to comprehend and understand fully. We can have a glimmer because of what he tells us. By the Spirit of God, we can see more deeply into it, but the natural mind simply cannot understand the faith and the trust and the certainty that Jesus Christ had in his knowledge of God. Can you imagine what it's like from God's position in heaven? You know, many years ago, I think it's almost 75 years or so ago, there was a young man in Iowa, the son of a farmer, who had this burning desire to study the heavens. And he saw a plan in some magazine or other, and for building a telescope. And so he assembled parts from the farm. He used a cream separator for a pedestal, and he used pieces of machinery for equipment to build himself a telescope so that he could study the stars. And he became extremely knowledgeable. So knowledgeable that he was contacted by an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, to come and work for them. They asked him because he had an interest in a specific and particular interest in discovering a planet that had been proposed but had never been found out in space. And so they invited him to come and see if he could use their equipment, their machinery, and photograph the heavens and study in looking for this planet, this unknown planet that was hidden from from astronomers to this point. This young man, I forget his name, I'm going on memory. This young man took the job, and I think it was about 9 months later, but I'm not sure of the time frame, he found this planet, and they named it Pluto. Tiny little planet that they could only see it because of the movement and the shift on photographs, and he was able to find that, and then by comparing, he ultimately found it, and they found it. It's the most distant planet in our, apparently in our orbital system, our solar system. Can you imagine what it is like to be out there and to be looking back here? Can you imagine what it would be like to be on Pluto and to try to describe what it is like to Plutoians, of you folks back here on the earth, impossible. I don't believe that we can comprehend the faith of God that comes through the knowledge that He has from eternity. That is the point. And yet Jesus Christ, as He went through life, particularly as He went through His ministry, began to explain apparently to recall events that He had experienced eternity past. And a proof of this, or at least an indication of it, is in Scripture. In Hebrews chapter 11, we read, Hebrews 11:1, that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, Hebrews is a beautiful chapter on the subject of faith. And we go through the examples of faith. I'm not going to take the time to go through this verse by verse. You're familiar with it. But if we go through this and we examine the lives of the individuals referred to in Hebrews 11, it's quite interesting because we find that these were real human beings who lived in very troublous times in some cases, who experienced great trials and tests and hardships and temptations and in some cases death. As a matter of fact, he said that these people, through faith, verse 33, subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn asunder, and so on. And verse 39, having obtained a good report, so they were faithful, through faith, they obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. What a paradox. In many cases, these people died even though there was a promise of deliverance and protection. In some cases, they died because they chose death rather than an alternative, which was offered to them. And the reason, he said in verse 40, is because God, having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. But I ask you, was their faith blind? Were these individuals blind? Of course not. Like Abraham, the forefather, our forefather, they saw a city. They saw something that others could not see. They saw the kingdom of God coming in the future. And so they were looking at that rather than at the present and circumstances immediately in front of them. So, faith is based upon something, though that something is not seen with the natural eye. Their faith was based upon something that could not be seen by the average, normal, natural, carnal human being. And I think these are some of the things that their faith was based upon. Number one is factual knowledge. They believed the recorded history handed down through the faithful patriarchs. They took the factual knowledge of experience from individuals who were there at the time of the flood, pre-flood, after, post-flood. That factual knowledge. There were a lot of people who did not accept those facts, however. And those facts were twisted and maligned and skewed by individuals who did not have faith and who did not accept the way the story was told, the way it actually happened. But these men, the faithful, had factual knowledge and they accepted that. Secondly, they had factual experience, which was faithfully recorded and transmitted through the patriarchs. Thirdly, they received external information and forces outside of themselves through the Spirit of God and spirit beings, angels. Spiritual sight, set on spiritual objectives, not on the carnal and on the physical. If they got their eyes off of the spiritual and onto the physical, then faith began to wane and waver. And these examples are examples of people who did not. The evidence is clear. The evidence is, and the proof of their faith is their actions. The actions they took based upon the knowledge of the facts. Past experience, if you please. Sometimes their own personal experience. And based upon an ability to see from external information. And another evidence of their faith is the performance, that is the follow-through. You know, it's one thing to make a commitment, but it is another to follow through to fulfillment. We make all kinds of commitments in life and we don't perform. We don't follow through. Performance relates to endurance. Their faith is also evidenced by the results, that is the outcome, that is based upon their actions and their performance on their commitments. Faith may be placed on both physical and spiritual things. And let me explain this, because I think sometimes we don't understand that there's even an interrelationship between the physical and the spiritual in the sense of faith. For example, when you get up in the morning, if you use a gas range for your cooking stove, you go into the kitchen, you ladies, or some of you men, and you start to prepare breakfast, and maybe you have decided you're going to scramble some eggs, and what do? You turn the stove on, you put a skillet with the eggs in it on the burner. Now, when you turn that stove on, what do you expect? An explosion? No, you expect a flame. And that's what you get. And that's what you've gotten, perhaps for 20, 30, 40, 50 or more years. So by experience, you come to expect what you have always gotten. And you have confidence, or a physical form of faith in a physical matter, a physical thing. But you know what? There are times when that thing won't light. I've experienced that. Have you? Because the pilot light has gone out. And you know what? There have been a few individuals who've had the thing kind of blow up on them because there was a problem and leaking gas in there, and they didn't smell it in time. So we can learn, and we do learn from physical things. You know, when you put the key in your car in the ignition and turn it on and engage the starter, you expect to hear that particular sound. And you expect that car to start. Every once in a while, in certain parts of the world where there are certain conflicts, political and otherwise, when people turn that thing on, they hear another sound. It's a boom sound, because somebody has put a bomb under their vehicle. They don't expect that because they have never had that experience before. They have faith that engaging the starter is going to start the car, not blow it up into smithereens. That's all physical, isn't it? And we go through life, and we just live, in effect. We do day after day after day, most of our living based upon faith, which is based upon the facts and the experiences of our past. All that we can see. Now, that's a carnal kind of faith. But it ought to teach us something about the spiritual kind of faith as well. A spiritual example of faith, I think, is perhaps illustrated best by the examples of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. Because, understand the setting of this. The Babylonian Wars began in the West Asia in about, 605 BC. 605, 604, Nebuchadnezzar led an army against Carchemish up on the Euphrates River in what is, I guess, Turkey, or right on the Turkish border with Syria. And in this great battle, he defeated Pharaoh Necho and his army. There's a story, I think it's Josephus tells, of Pharaoh Necho being almost being encircled and almost overwhelmed by the armies of Nebuchadnezzar, by the soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar. And according to Josephus, it was Jewish soldiers who extricated him from that trap and made it possible for him to flee and return to Egypt, where he told a story of how great a success he had just had in the battle at Carchemish, according to one record. Be that as it may, Nebuchadnezzar, beginning 605, began to a conquest of West Asia. And he came on down through the Palestine area all the way to the borders of Egypt. About 604, as I recall, his father died suddenly, and Nebuchadnezzar was recalled back to Babylon and made king. There was some skirmishing and apparently some difficulty between Nebuchadnezzar and another heir, but Nebuchadnezzar was able to prevail. In the 7th year of his reign now, according to historian, the Egyptians sought unsuccessfully to reestablish their power over Palestine area, including Tyre, Sidon, the coastal cities. And so Nebuchadnezzar went once again with an army to besiege Tyre. And while Tyre was under siege, he took another portion of his army down into Judah. And he attacked the Jews because they too had broken their alliance with him and had joined with the Egyptians in trying to throw off the yoke of Babylon. He killed Jehoiakim and put Jehoiakim on the throne in his place. 3 months later, he deposed Jehoiakim, carried him captive to Babylon. So this was somewhere in the vicinity or the period around 597, 596 BC, we assume. During this period of time, there were some young Jewish lads who were taken back to Babylon. The Babylonians had a concept, as I understand it, to use foreigners like this who had no base within the country to bring them in and train them and use them as functionaries in government. They found to be more reliable than using their own people. It made good sense to them, at least, to take these capable young people from royal families and from the elite, the educated ones, from conquered countries, and bring them in and place them in responsible positions after training. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel were among those, as you know, according to Daniel's account. And for approximately 10 to 12 years, we don't know precisely, these men served the Babylonians in whatever capacity. They served the Babylonians, but they always looked to Jerusalem as their home. Now, I ask you, they were captives. Did they long for their home? Did they pray and ask God to protect their homes? Did they pray to God for deliverance and return to their homes? Do you think they were unnatural? Do you think they were any different from you? I believe just like you and I, they were praying to go home for 10 long years. But during that period of time, they remained loyal to their overseers and their duties to those they were serving, but they also remained loyal to God. Even though they prayed to God, I'm sure, Scripture doesn't say this, but I'm sure of it, and asked Him for deliverance so they could return to their homes. Daniel chapter 3 is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I want to show you something about the kind of faith that these young men had. When they were told they had to bow down to this image or else, and a fiery furnace was prepared, and they refused to obey, and the fiery furnace was heated 7 times hotter. Once again, they were offered the option of denying God and bowing down to this idol. Verse 16, Daniel 3:16 tells us, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king. So it was the top honcho, top man. O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in this matter, or that is, we don't have to think about it. We don't have to study to answer this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Do you understand do you see what they're saying? They are saying if God's will is that we are sacrificed and forfeit our lives, then it doesn't change anything. Now, on what basis or why could these young men have the confidence and the trust in God, knowing there was the probability or possibility that He might choose not to deliver them? Because they had formed a habit. Their character was set in trust and belief in God without regard to God's will and plan for them. Meaning, by that I mean that they understood that God had a purpose and a higher will and a higher plan. And they fit in that plan somewhere, and they weren't concerned one way or the other. So they had total confidence in whatever the outcome, it would be to the glory of God. And they were prepared to accept it. Why? Because probably for 10 years, they had been experiencing prayers that God had chosen to say no to. God delivered them from that furnace, but He didn't deliver them from captivity. Their faith was not predicated upon God granting them their every desire, their personal desires. And they accepted God's decision to choose or not to choose to intervene according to their prayers. In like manner, though, God delivered Daniel, placing him in a position of great power. Yet, he was a captive. He was not free to leave and go back to Jerusalem on his own. But Daniel's faith was not based upon God delivering him from captivity, though I'm sure he prayed to return home many times. Daniel served the Babylonians faithfully. He served the Persians, he served the Medes and the Babylonians faithfully, all the while he was a captive in Babylon. And God allowed Daniel's faith to be tested severely by that system after many years. And I've wondered why the particular test that Daniel was given. Have you ever studied about the particular test in Daniel 6? Have you thought about why Daniel was tested as he was? If you recall in Daniel 6, verse 6, all these presidents ganged up on Daniel. They assembled together before the king, and they said, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdoms, the governors and princes and counselors and captains have consulted together to establish a royal decree, a royal statute, and to make a firm decree that whoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of you, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now that was a lie. All of them hadn't been included. Daniel had been excluded. So they lied to Darius, and they deceived him, and he went along with it. Well, that's a good idea. That ought to unify the kingdom, and unity is important, isn't it? Isn't it more important that we have unity than any other thing, that we're all on the same page on this thing here? Have you ever heard that? This idea of why it's just so much better if we just all have unity at any cost. And so it was set up. And you know the story. Daniel was cast into the lion's den. The king, when he realized what had happened, tried to maneuver out of it and tried to figure out a way, but he was unable because of the way the law was written. The law, the law, the law. Have the law. You've got to stick by the law. And if you deviate from the law, in this case, as these individuals had set it up, actually the law they didn't set up, but the situation, the circumstances didn't matter. Well, as you know, after the night was over, Darius came to the den and he cried with a loud voice in verse 20. Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve continually able to deliver you from the lions? And then Daniel said to the king, O king, respect to you. That's kind of what this means. O king, live forever. He showed respect to the king because this was the way the king was greeted and the way he was referred to. O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as, now listen carefully, before him innocency was found in me, and also before you, O king, have I done no hurt. Oh. This test was, Daniel understood, Daniel perceived, this test was to determine what was in his heart. It was something that was between himself and God, because there is always the possibility when an individual is involved in a political environment and situation such as Daniel was, that power may become very important and hard to let go of. Do you perceive? Do you see here what Daniel was really being tested on? Daniel had already been demoted at one point and elevated again. It is tough to be demoted from a high position. It is almost impossible for the carnal mind, the natural man, to take demotion. Especially once one is in position of power and high position. It is awfully hard. It's like slashing your wrists. But Daniel did not covet that power, did not covet position over those people like those other guys did. They were covetous of his power. They were covetous of his position. And so God does two things here. One, in Babylon, he demonstrates the heart of this man who feared him and whose heart was set on him. He demonstrates there was no covetousness for power inside of his heart. And he also shows the contrast to the others. Daniel was not even slightly corrupted by the satanic systems that he had been serving for years. During the life of Jesus, we're told that he learned through the things that he suffered or experienced, as I said a bit earlier. Two examples of that in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, and John 8:38. Luke 10:18 says, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I saw Satan fall as lightning from heaven. He was there. And in his mind, then, Jesus actually could recall that picture, that image of Satan being cast down from heaven. And secondly, in John 8:38, I speak what I have seen with my Father, and you do what you have seen with your Father. Jesus was able to call on his experience for eternity past, so he had absolute faith, confidence, and trust in the power of God, the will of God, the intention of God, the mind of God, the Spirit of God, and what God would do for him. He also understood and knew the plan of God, including his own death. Now then, let's go to Matthew 21:21 that we started with. In Matthew 21:21, Jesus replied to those who were testing him, I tell you the truth, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, this is the instance of the fig tree having been smitten, but also you can say to this mountain or hill, go throw yourself into the sea and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. Now, do we understand Jesus' statement? In the light of experience with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the patriarchs and those who died not having received the promises, do we understand now that Jesus is not saying that if you covet a $1 million house up on top of the hill out here and you ask for it, that he is automatically going to give it to you, or that you will be taken out of the particular set of circumstances you find yourself in. It does seem that God leaves us in the circumstances in which we are called or in which we find ourselves. He leaves us in those circumstances and then teaches us by experience to trust him to manage within those circumstances until he removes us by whatever means in whatever time frame. You know, to understand this particular verse, really, we have to understand the context, because it does appear that Jesus is making a flat statement. You know, every once in a while, somebody comes at me with a statement. The Bible says, and then they pull a scripture out of context, and they throw it at me, and then it's like, okay, now, you deal with it. It's a wrong spirit and a wrong attitude when we do that. It's extremely difficult, I think. It's extremely easy for us to pull a scripture out of context and take it in the way that we are thinking in the carnal, natural mind, and then apply it and use it as a weapon or as a tool to get what we may particularly want at the moment. In order to understand, I would go back and begin in Matthew 16, because really there is no beginning place other than Matthew 1, but Matthew 16 in this case is at least a safe beginning and a place where we can start to understand Matthew 21 better. Matthew 16:1, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. Wrong spirit, wrong attitude, and Jesus Christ's response was, when evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Then he left them and went away. Now, I take it, frankly, the way this is cast, I take it that Jesus said this rather forcefully, and I would suspect with some passion. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. So he's putting it on them. That's what they were, a wicked and adulterous generation. And it really was burning him. These people were putting him on the skillet and trying to fry him and force him into making some kind of a statement that they could use against him. And so when they went across the lake, so please understand there's a continuation here. I'm not sure how long. It may have been 30 minutes. It may have been... Have you ever seen the Sea of Galilee and how, it's not really that far across there, although it can be very dangerous to cross. It's a few miles, I guess. And when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. And they told Christ, and he said, be careful. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they discussed this among themselves and said, oh, he is upset because we didn't bring any bread. My words, they were concerned about eating. They were concerned about the physical situation they were in. And his mind was still back there on what the scribes and Pharisees had said and done, and their spirit and their attitude, which was wrong, which was satanic. And he was still responding to that situation back there. And aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you of little faith. Now, that was not a statement. He's asking a question. But here's how he places them. You oligopistis individuals. That means little faith individuals in Greek. You little folks with a pinhead of faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Look, the physical is unimportant. It's insignificant. Don't worry about it. How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? How is it that they missed? And why? Why? Because their minds were on the physical, and they had that lesson and that experience back there was just gone from their heads, right out of their brains, right out of their minds. Be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then they understood, oh, he's talking about guarding against the yeast used not in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, understand something. Remember this. They were talking about the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The reason why I would draw a circle around that, note it and remember it, because most of the things that flow from this through Matthew 21 are relating back to the teachings of the Pharisees and the scribes, and the spirit and the attitude of the scribes and Pharisees. And so what Jesus does and what Jesus says is in response to the carnal, unconverted spirit and attitude influenced by Satan the devil of the scribes and Pharisees. Beware of the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, his mind was focused on spiritual plane, on spiritual level, and his disciples' minds were on the physical plane. Chapter 16 and verse 13, continuing right on. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked, that's on the east side, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? What are you hearing out there? What's going on? What's on the street? Jesus asked. And they replied, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? And Simon Peter stepped forward and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He had it all mapped out, and it just came to him. It just, right out of the blue. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Inspiration. That's right, exactly. That's what it was. It was inspiration. Following on. Jesus replied, verse 17, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." Peter had inspiration. Something was put into his mind, and his mind was opened up. Carnal as he was, impetuous as he was, presumptuous as he was, his mind was opened up so that he could understand a spiritual truth and principle. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock, meaning himself, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. You're a little pebble here, Peter. You're a little stone, but on this giant stone, Craig, I will build my church, and nothing's going to destroy it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. So here Jesus is saying that Peter, at that moment, was focused properly. He was focused on the spiritual. A rare instance, I think, but it was true. And from that time on, verse 21, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day and be raised to life. Okay, so from the time that Peter was inspired by God and had the revelation that he was Christ, the Son of the living God, then Jesus began to explain to them what that meant, what being the Christ meant, what being the Son of the living God meant in that time and for us. And that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Now, notice something. The man who had the inspiration from God, whose mind was opened by God, who was used by God to make that statement in front of all of the other disciples and that witness to Christ, responded immediately. Notice in verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. I think in the King James says upbraid him or something, but Peter took Jesus aside. Oh, now wait a minute. This can't be. You come and let me talk to you. And so Peter took him aside. I've got something to tell you. This is very important for you to understand. I can hear it now. Never, Lord. Won't let it happen. He said, this shall never happen to you. I won't let them. And God won't let them do this to you. And Jesus' response was just as immediate and even stronger. He said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. And you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Totally carnal. Same man, moments later, hours later, whatever, the same man who was inspired by the Spirit of God to discern a spiritual truth is now inspired by Satan to try to put a stumbling block in front of Jesus, and so that he would not fulfill the calling and commission which he had committed to. Peter had gone from thinking and speaking with spiritual understanding to reacting and speaking on the carnal plane. And Jesus cut him off in a hurry. You know, there is a time, and there are lots of them, but there is a time to cut things off in a moment and not let them take root. Anytime there is this doubt, or anytime there's this thought, never entertain it. When you sense, when you know in your heart, on the moment, on the spur of the moment, when you know something is wrong, don't entertain it. And this is what Jesus is teaching, or by practice here, this is what he is teaching. Now, I've checked the commentaries on all of this to be sure what I can find, at least of what is taught out there in the world.
They understand that Peter used very strong language, and they can explain to you in the Greek how this is extremely strong language that Peter used here, and also extremely strong language that Jesus used in rebuking Peter. And they also recognize that Peter was not only thinking carnally, but they recognized that he was strongly influenced by Satan. You know, Jesus said to Peter, and I don't recall the chapter and verse, Peter, Satan has desired you, but I have prayed for you. He has desired you that he may sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you. And, you know, why didn't he do that for Judas? Have you ever wondered? I have. I've thought about that for 40 years or more. Poor Judas. Poor old Judas. You know, Judas just got caught. I think we need to understand that Judas, Christ knew what he was, and I mean that in here, when he called him to be among the 12. He called him to do what he did. He called him for a purpose. Somebody had to do it. Somebody had to be that Judas, the term. And yet, Satan was not satisfied with the one that God called and had prepared to do the job. Satan wanted somebody else, and that somebody he wanted was Peter. And we won't go after that because there's a lot more reason for that, but it's immaterial. God is working out a purpose here below, and that's the bottom line in every question that arises in these matters. It is just that God has a purpose that he is working out. He's using us. He's working out a purpose in our lives individually, and he's also working out a purpose that is larger than our individual circumstances. It's his purpose for his kingdom. Peter was very presumptuous and rambunctious, but Peter was probably not unlike some of us in jumping to conclusions, thinking human thoughts rather than in thinking properly and thinking God's thoughts. Now, following this exchange, Jesus continues in verse 24 with another very appropriate, significant teaching that flows from all that has preceded. Verse 24, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. What's he saying? Okay, he's saying, look, God's will comes first. If you want to follow me, God's will comes first. And whatever God chooses, however he chooses to use you within that overall scheme, you accept that and you come right on and you continue without regard to your personal considerations. That's what he's saying. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come to his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. But how did they do it? How did they see it? Well, chapter 17, verse 1 gives us the transfiguration. We won't take the time to go through that verse by verse. You know it. And in that transfiguration, they saw Jesus, and they saw, let's see, who was it? Daniel and Elijah, Moses and Elijah, and Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And as they were coming down off the mountain, then Jesus instructed them not to tell anyone what they had seen, because they had seen something which was spiritual, which the carnal mind and carnal men could not understand and apprehend and put in its proper place. Until, he said, the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Now later they could tell it. And so notice something in chapter 17, now verse 10. Because this also flows from what they had seen. Why, they asked, then, do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? A logical question based upon the experiences that they had just had seeing the kingdom of God in vision. Well, verse 11, Jesus replied to that. Elijah, to be sure, comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist as being fulfilling the prophecy concerning Elijah. And that John the Baptist had been imprisoned. Now, you check the commentaries, and they make a big deal out of the fact that, well, the Jews, the leaders had nothing whatsoever to do with putting John in prison, and they had nothing whatsoever to do with John's being beheaded. That was all this Gentile, the action of these Gentile tyrants who were over them. No, it was the system that killed John. Never forget it. The whole system is what got John killed. And it was the system that would kill Jesus Christ. The individuals themselves, personally, the participants, and those who were supporting the various participants in the crucifixion of Jesus were insignificant in comparison to the overall system that was responsible. And that system, of course, is Satan's system, which Jesus has qualified to displace, replace, and overthrow. And which is going to be overthrown very shortly, I suspect. Now, when they came to the crowd, chapter 17, verse 14, jumping down verse 14, a man approached Jesus, knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. Oh, now, Jesus had given them authority over demons to cast them out and power to heal the sick. But something had gone wrong here. And he said, Jesus then said in verse 17, O unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. So Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed from that moment. And then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? Why couldn't we do it? And he replied, because you have so little faith. Oligopistis, little faith in the Greek. I tell you the truth. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible to you. Now, what's all this about? Was Jesus really concerned about moving a mountain? You go to the commentaries and they tell you, oh, he's referring here in symbolism about this system, the legalistic system, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant system, and how it had not borne fruit. They used the cursing of the fig tree incident, but he's going to cast this mountain into the sea, which is the Gentile world, and therefore then out of the sea will all these wonderful good things are going to come. The Christian church is going to develop out of the Gentile world. Have you ever read that nonsense? Well, that's not exactly the way they say it. But that's sort of the intent. Now, there's an element of truth in the explanation of the parables. No question about it. But the spirit behind it is just as wrong as the spirit that was behind the scribes and the Pharisees when they were talking to Jesus and they were challenging him and asking about Elijah and all those other questions that he has already dealt with earlier. Mark's account makes it quite clear that Jesus is saying, in effect, there was a problem with the disciples. The problem with the disciples is simply very simple, really. Very simple. They had a problem with having allowed what the power and the authority that really was Christ's, which he had freely conferred on them, which they had used, and they had seen their fruits and the results of it, the actions, the response, how demons had obeyed them, and they rejoiced. You know the accounts. And the sick were healed. They had apparently developed an attitude problem. Now, some think that it was an attitude that they viewed this power and authority which they had kind of like or akin to magic. Say the right words, use the right formula, and this is what will happen. As a matter of fact, when you look at what developed as Christianity afterward, you have to see that that is, in fact, what the majority of Christians came to believe, that it's a formula, a system that is applied, and it just gives these wonderful results. But in reality, Jesus said the focus is totally different. The focus is not on we have this power, this magical power. The focus is that by going to God, He has the power, that He has the authority, and He applies that power and that authority in doing the work. The disciples got their eyes off of the one who really and truly was the authority and the power, and they got it upon themselves, undoubtedly. Because Jesus, again, had to rebuke them for their unbelief, their little faith. And it's not the Greek, apparently. I'm not a Greek scholar, so I can't tell you. I just, all I can do is use the tools. But apparently, the Greek thought means that it is a poor quality of faith, not a little amount. Even a little faith, like the grain of sand or mustard seed, is significantly powerful enough to do what man needs to have done. It's the quality of faith that is significantly wrong in the disciples here. And so, following this, then, Jesus saw a fig tree. And Matthew 20, 1, on his way into the city to Bethany, or out from the city, or into the city, he cursed this fig tree because there was no fruit on it. Now, in that instance, the fig tree dried up and died and fell apart. You know, trees don't die like that, naturally. It takes weeks or months for a fig tree or for any tree to die. You can wring a tree, and it will begin to wilt in a few days. And it'll start to show distress after a few weeks, and it will die, depending on the time of the year, as a matter of fact. If you do it in the autumn, it's you won't notice any change, perhaps, until the next spring. It just doesn't put forth fruit because it's been girdled. Now, Jesus is using this as an example to teach a lesson to them. The fig tree incident. It was not the time for figs. But here was a tree that proclaimed, that portrayed itself as being fruitful and being ready with fruit. And so Jesus saw it. It was out of sync, out of season, but those things do happen sometimes. And so he went, it triggered his hunger because he hadn't had breakfast, apparently. Or he was hungry for whatever reason, and so he went, and there were no figs on it. And it was like the nation of Israel. when the time came, there ought to be some fruit on the tree. Nothing really of consequence, but just show had been born. Leaves. Cursing the fig tree is a parable, an action that is related to cleansing of the temple and the cleansing of the nation, conveying to Israel that they had squandered an opportunity to be the servants of God and to be a light to the world as they had been called to do. And Jesus said in Matthew 21:21, then, I tell you the truth, after these incidents, if you have faith and do not doubt. They had seen these events occur. Not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea and it'll be done. Or if you believe, he said, you will receive whatever you ask. So it's in this context that Jesus made the statement concerning what if you believe, whatsoever you ask will be done. I think it's very important for us to understand that when we have a statement like this that appears to be, on the one hand, just a blanket statement. You believe, you ask for it, it's going to be yours. You must go back and look at that in the context in which that statement is made. Getting back to the subject of faith, as we read earlier, faith is the substance, and yet it's a spiritual substance. Spirit has substance. Substance, and there's been a lot of debating, remember that, about substance some years ago, and some of our friends began to be concerned about the nature of God, and they were going to figure it out and explain it to all of us so that we could all understand the nature of God. Some years past, and they just, this one individual just really had it all mapped out. He said. And there is a word in the Greek that has to, means that which holds up, that which stands under, that which supports. Faith is a spiritual thing that has support. It has an underpinning. It has substance of things that are not seen. Experience is something that is not seen. You know, I have thought many times, how can I convey some of the experiences that I had when I was a young man? How can I convey my experience in instances where I was in some danger? I don't want to go there, but I'm just to illustrate and how I saw God's intervention. I will use one illustration. I was working on a construction job. I think this was in 1955, and we were building a road in Texas. And I was running a machine, and it ran out of gasoline. It was a heavy roller, rolling pavement. And so I went down and got the supply truck and brought it back and grabbed a funnel and a 5-gallon can of gasoline to fill up the gas tank on my machine because I wanted to keep up. I didn't want to get behind. And I didn't let the machine cool off long enough. And I knew better, but you're young and foolish. You think you can cut corners sometimes. So I put the funnel into the filler and started pouring gasoline. The tank was under the seat of this machine, so I was standing on the board and leaning over the 5-gallon can like this, pouring gasoline in it, and it blew up. Because somebody had broken the neck on the funnel, and the gasoline was running down on a hot clutch drum. And it blew. How else does gasoline ignite under those circumstances? It blew. And when it blew up, the can went up over my head, I was standing in the middle of the road. The can was on the other side of the road, and I was watching the flames as they were shooting up into the above the machine. My co-workers were down the road a couple hundred yards, and they saw it blow me out of the machine, and they thought I was done for. I stood looking at this machine burning, and I grabbed a shovel and started throwing sand and put the fire out of the machine, while the can of gasoline, what was left of it, is burning over here on the side of the road. And like a fool, I walked over and I threw sand on the gas can and put it out. Have you ever seen what 1 gallon of gas can do when it explodes? I have. I was driving along a road one time when a man was filling a lawnmower with a 1 gallon can of gasoline, and when it blew, it sounded like a stick of dynamite. But you know, my friends came rushing up. They thought I was done, and I didn't have a singed hair on my head or my hands, not one. Now then, you tell me how that happened. I don't know. I can't explain it. I think I know, and I think it's based upon the fact that God said, this young fool needs help. He doesn't know enough to come in out of the rain, so therefore, in His mercy, He somehow just opted, when He saw what a stupid thing I was doing, He decided to put some kind of a protective force there to look after this stupid idiot. That's all I can figure. I could tell you more stories. About 3 incidents of that sort occurred in my life, and after the third one, I thought, you know, I wonder if God is trying to tell me something. Maybe I should not be here. It took about a year and a half for me to finally come to it. Can you imagine anybody being that stupid? I didn't get the point for a while. A couple more incidents occurred that I walked away from with no injury. Faith is a spiritual thing. It is based upon experience, based upon facts, based upon actions, but it does have substance. Never forget it. And anybody who says it does, send them to me. Faith is based upon a history of performance of God in my life and in your life and in the lives of people God has called and been working with for the history of man. Faith is based upon an understanding of God's will and purpose, however. Faith is based upon personal experience in walking with God. Now, Jesus asked the question, when the Son of Man returns, will He find faith on earth? Well, I think He will, if we, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, recognize God's will and declare our faith in God to act on our behalf according to His will. If we endure the trials of this life, if we trust in Christ's teaching that a little faith, even a little, like yours and mine, can move mountains. If also we humble ourselves as Jesus did and give the praise and the glory to God. For any success in His work or in our personal lives, yes, I think He will find faith when He comes.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.